actually, you shouldn't be clapping for me. I should be clapping for all of you. I got to glimpse just a few minutes in the last presentation, and I told Margaret that I would like to have the date of this symposium for next year way ahead of time, so I can block my entire day and be here. Because just listening to the graduate students who were talking, it was refreshing. It fed my soul. And so I would say the thanks goes to all of you. But in my official capacity as Provost, or some of you might have heard how my grandkids refer to me as the Provolone, I really want to add my welcome to you, to DePaul University, and for this inaugural symposium for the Social Transformation Research Collaborative. This symposium really brings together in our community students and faculty at all levels to discuss different ideas. We also have some nationally recognized scholars who have been able to join us. So thank you for those of you who have already presented and for those of you who will present this evening. So tonight, our final talk will come from Dr. Duchess Harris, Chair of the American Studies Program at Macalester University, who will offer the closing presentation of the conference. And you're going to learn a little bit more about her in just a few minutes. But what I want to talk to you just for a couple of minutes is we are living in a time when questions about regarding the value of a college education in general and the humanities in particular. And many will ask, why do you think this is relevant? Why is it necessary? Why did we pursue this opportunity? And the answer is very simple. This is how you prepare students to become global citizens, by providing them this educational experience that reflects the complexity of cultural and social issues, the diversity of opinions and ways of thinking, and the appreciation of difference. In short, this collaborative is one way that DePaul prepares students to be well-rounded, critical thinkers and lifelong learners. And it really serves as a fitting complement to work that's being done across the university to address ongoing racial and social justice challenges we face today. And I refer you to work around campus that includes the work of, the work of the Georgia and Tanya Ruff Institute of Global Homelessness, the Presidential Fellows Program, and I know we have Jackie's with us today, working on that, which was established to create an opportunity for faculty to lend their expertise and help DePaul achieve specific strategic objectives related to diversity and inclusion. At DePaul, we also have the Inside Out Prison Exchange Program, and we have a lot of research that's happening in suicide prevention within the African American adolescent population. And I know, as some of you might have attended some of the visioning sessions with our new president, Rob Manuel, that he's really hoping that we will expand such efforts by looking at the problems of our society through the interdisciplinary lens. The spirit of connection also to one another, to the city of Chicago, and is another reason why DePaul embraces this work. Personal connection and interdependence lay at the very heart of our values, leading us to bring communities together through education. Working together, faculty, undergraduate students, graduate students, and with leading scholars from across the country really enables us to engage and have a stronger impact on racial and social justice concerns than any of us can achieve by ourselves. So seeing this collaborative work and this collaborative spirit at work makes me feel very pleasant and very proud. And please, Margaret, give me the opportunity that next year I can be here for a lot more to hear these wonderful ideas. But in the meantime, let me encourage you to lean into this moment and to be open to the possibilities. And thank you for joining us for this special session at DePaul University. Thank you. I was about to steal the phone accidentally. I'm glad I didn't.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce Dr. Duchess Harris. So Dr. Duchess Harris is a professor of American Studies and Political Science at Macalester University in St. Paul, Minnesota. She is an interdisciplinary scholar of African American history and political theory. And in order to do this work, she has both a doctorate and a JD. She's one of those, okay? And what Harris focuses on in her work are events that have been ignored by other academics and by mainstream media coverage. She has written 5 academic books, single-authored and edited collection, and numerous articles and book chapters, more than I wanted to count, okay, when I was putting this together. In addition to her academic pursuits, she has also created the Duchess Harris Collection, which is a series of 120 books for grades 4th through 12th that address gender, race, and class in America. It is an honor to bring a Black feminist political perspective to this campus. And I hope that we're all ready to listen to a Black woman and to bring Black feminist political theory to your classrooms and to your academic work. And with that, I will welcome Dr. Duchess Harris.
Goodness, thank you so much. I am so delighted to be here, and my heart is so full because I have a surprise. I had friends that were from the Twin Cities from down in Chicago. Barry Borich and Linnea Stinson come and surprise me, so that feels great. And I love seeing my sister scholar, soror, Jackie Lazu, and we have known each other half our lives. So this is just really an honor and a pleasure. And I didn't realize this is the first time you were having this conference. And so I'm excited to help you close it out. And flattered that you would spend Friday night in Chicago with me, because I know you all want to go and do some other stuff. And so what we have up here is an image of the jacket cover of my book, Black Feminist Politics from Kennedy to Trump. And that is the 3rd edition. This book originally came out in 2009, where I went up to the Clinton administration, and then came out in 2011 when I went up to Obama. And then this version came out in 2018 in time for midterm elections after Trump had been president for 2 years. And so it takes you up until that time period. Of course, my title for today is that I'm talking about Black feminist politics from Kennedy to Kamala. And I'm going to talk about how Black feminist organizing in local organizations influences Black feminist elites and political positions, and how they interact, and how I argue that the Black feminist political elites are beholden to the women who have done the organizing. So let me begin here. If, you know, how many letters do I have behind my name, and how do I know what to do with this? So,
Other way, like leave it on the top of the bottom.
am I holding it upside down? Oh, there we go. I'm a genius. Okay, excellent. You guys are confident this is going to go well, right? Okay, so a little bit about how this project came about. I moved to the Twin Cities from the East Coast in the fall of 1991 to go to graduate school to get a degree in American Studies. And it was a critical moment for me because this is when the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill hearings unfolded. So I'm going to talk cross generations, because I know that there are some people that remember this, and I know that for some people this might be what Manning Marable might call as modern history. We're going to emphasize modern because you're not going to make me feel old. So what's happening during this time is that President Bush has put forward Clarence Thomas as a nominee to be on the Supreme Court. And of course, for the confirmation, the hearings have to go through the Senate. There is a woman who works for National Public Radio named Nina Totenberg, who finds out that there had been some rumblings of sexual harassment allegations from someone who had worked for Clarence Thomas, and that was Anita Hill. I frame it that way because some people do not realize that Anita Hill did not want to come forward. She was pulled into the limelight. She was very resistant because she knew what kind of pushback this would be. The way that this impacted me so deeply personally is that this was actually the only access to like the world I had at the time. I was new to the Twin Cities. For those of you all who are young enough to not realize that there wasn't always internet and that long distance calls like actually cost money, right? I was glued to the television. And what I was seeing was this Black woman who was a professor who was being indicted, even though it was not her hearing. Anita Hill and I are very different. She's a social conservative. One of the reasons why she worked for Clarence Thomas is because she had a similar politic to him. Even though we were very different, I was sympathetic to the fact that she was a rare Black woman professor who was being treated poorly. Not only was she being treated poorly, it was a moment for me to interrogate the Democratic Party for the first time. The person who was in charge of the hearings was none other who's now President Biden, who was a senator at the time. This was disruptive to me because I grew up in like a Jesse Jackson Democratic family. And so I didn't have a sophisticated enough analysis at the time to realize that there are blue dog Democrats, there's centrist moderate Democrats, and then they're more like radical Jesse Jackson, Paul Wellstone kind of Democrats. And so I did not understand who Biden was, but we start to learn who Biden is. And so this means that, you know, I end up becoming very surprised that I live long enough that Biden actually becomes president and that he actually appoints a Black woman to the Supreme Court who gets confirmed, right? Which I wasn't sure how that was going to turn out. And then his vice president ends up becoming another Black woman, Kamala Harris. All of this, though, I argue, comes from pressure from the Congressional Black Caucus, right? And so the brokering that's happening when Biden wants to win is that he has to meet with James Clyburn from South Carolina, who says there's no way in the world we're going to endorse you without some of this, right? So your running mate, here's your list. They're Black women, right? Your Supreme Court nominee list. Think about some Black women. And if you do all that, we will get behind you, right? And you need Black people to end up getting the presidency. So one of the things I'm going to talk about today is how presidential politics has always struggled with race, class, and gender, which in 2022 and in a meeting like this, that might seem like a simple argument. But if you know anything about the discipline of political science, that is an argument that they have been resistant to for hundreds of years, and also resistant to it the way that I frame it. So who inspired my research questions? I was an undergrad at the University of Pennsylvania, and this woman here, Dr. Mary Frances Berry, was my academic advisor. I will be honest with you, this facial expression that she has, like, constant, right? So I was terrified of her, right? So I'm 19 years old, and I'm told I have to meet with my academic advisor for 15 minutes, and I have about 1 minute prepared, and I don't know what I'm gonna do with the other 14. And so I think she felt sorry for me, and she said, you should probably read the work of this woman, and this is Paula Giddings. And so Paula Giddings had recently published, because I'm in college between 87 and 91, When and Where I Enter, the impact of Black women on race and sex in America. And it was the first time I saw myself in some kind of academic reflection that wasn't a novel, right? I'd only found Black women through literature. And so I'd found Black women through Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and others. And I originally thought that was the kind of academic project that I was going to do. But I found this to be compelling because what Giddings does is that she argues that Black men articulated a political agenda in 1963 at the March on Washington. And she even breaks it down further and says it's a particular kind of Black men, right? So it's men who are part of the Southern Black church, they're Protestants, they're middle class, and you know, they have a certain agenda that's going to exclude someone like Byron Rustin, who's actually doing the organizing, and they're going to be resistant to someone like Josephine Baker speaking at the March on Washington because they want to marginalize women. These, of course, are all things that I've never thought about before. Giddings goes on to say that also in '63, The Feminine Mystique comes out, which is a book that I'm not familiar with. And then I learned that Betty Friedan has a large audience where she's providing a political agenda for middle-class white women. And basically, this is the generation that is going to come after World War II, where, you know, the economy spikes, we get the creation of suburbia. Women who had to be kind of Rosie the Riveter now are being told they didn't have to be, and that they could live in suburbia and stay at home with their children. For white-collar women who wanted education and white-collar jobs, that didn't seem satisfying. And so Giddings actually starts her book in the 19th century. And so she closes it out by asking who was presented the political agenda for Black women in '63. And so this is when I asked Dr. Berry to answer this for me. And Dr. Berry, whom I actually had never seen a Black woman have both a law degree and a PhD. So I like to just look at her, right? Because I was like, I didn't even know this could happen. And so when I asked her that, she said, I don't know, which I didn't think was because I thought she knew everything. And so when she said she didn't really have something to direct me to, I realized that that's where I could enter. Right? And so this is where I decided I was going to go on this journey and do this project where I had two main questions, which was, what did Black women do to gain political power in the late 20th century? And then why, in many cases, did they not succeed? And people will tell you, when you're doing your research, you shouldn't make assumptions, right? But the not succeeding was kind of all I had to do was leave my house. And I was like, it didn't work, right? And so I had to frame it like this. And so my point of departure ends up being John F. Kennedy's Commission on the Status of Women. And this commission met between '61 and '63. It was chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, who actually passes away in '62. And the good news about the Presidential Commission is that it's the first office of the White House that acknowledges that Black women have different public policy concerns from Black men and white women. So this has not happened regardless of what other presidents have tried to think about. What is disappointing, however, is that the body meets for 2 years. And none of the Black women's suggestions are included in the final report or in the New York Times coverage. And so the reports were in the archives of the University of Minnesota. What I find out is that they have 11 committees looking at different public policy areas, right? So there's a committee on housing, there's a committee on education. Then they have 4 consultative bodies. And the 4th consultative body is called Problems of Negro Women. Right? And so that is where these women convened to give you an idea of who the chair of it was. It was the late, great Dorothy Height, who had been, very much involved in the National Council of Negro Women. But also, here's the rub. Lorraine Hansberry is on it. And Lorraine Hansberry is quite the critic of the Kennedy administration. And if you know anything about her, she ends up being invited, along with James Baldwin and some others, to meet with Bobby Kennedy. And she indicts him for, not really being committed to the civil rights movement. And so part of it is that the Kennedy administration doesn't understand the nuances and differences within Black America. So they're like, you're a smart Black woman, you're a smart Black woman, it must all be the same, right? But Dorothy Height and Lorraine Hansberry are not the same. And some of the suggestions that they were making were a little ahead of where the country was ready for it. So for instance, one of the things that they were advocating for is what ends up becoming Head Start, but the nation isn't ready for that at the time. So when does this report come out? It's released 2 months after the March on Washington, 1 year before Fannie Lou Hamer speaks before a before a segregated Democratic National Convention, and 2 years before the Voting Rights Act is passed. And so this is the kind of Democratic Party that we're talking about. We're talking about a Democratic Party that is still completely all white and likes being white. Like, that's the other thing, right? They're not really interested in moving at all. And so trying to hear from someone like Lorraine Hansberry, this is slightly before its time. So after the report comes out, Black women are trying to figure out how they're going to be involved in, social organizations. And so if we go from 63 to 66, you get, of course, these two critical organizations that people in this room are very familiar with, right? Which is the Black Panther Party and the National Organization for Women. So Black women had kind of tenuous relationships in both of these groups, right? As we know, the only woman who's ever a leader of the Panther Party is Elaine Brown, and that is only due to the fact that when Huey P. Newton goes to prison, he leaves Elaine in charge because she's his lover, and he feels like he can keep close tabs on what's going on in the movement. And a lot of Black women felt like there was too much patriarchy for them to have space. Then, of course, in the National Organization for Women, there's definitely Black women who are involved with them in the beginning. They've got a lot of critique that it wasn't open to Black women. What it was open to was middle-class Black women. So that's what's going on there. There are not a lot of working-class Black women that are attracted to the National Organization for Women. And so this kind of is the backdrop for something I'm going to talk about in a minute. I just want to skip over now to electoral politics real quick and talk about, once again, like within the discipline of political science, they like you to run numbers, right? They want you to look at voting patterns. When you come from a community that wasn't legally allowed to vote until 4 years before you were born, there's not a lot to count, right? And so you don't get a congressional Black caucus until around the same time. So it's like a few years after the Panthers and the National Organization for Women. It's around 1968 that you get this group of folk. And in 1971, what you have here is a whole bunch of dudes and Shirley Chisholm. Right? And so Shirley Chisholm is sitting there unbought and unbossed as the only woman. And when she decides to run for president, the only two men that support her at all are Ron Dellums from California and Perrin Mitchell from Maryland. And so, once again, here's a narrative about, patriarchy and Black women standing on their own. And a colleague of mine named Anastasia Kerwood has like the new Shirley Chisholm book coming out, which I've not read yet because it's like coming out right now. And so Shirley Chisholm is one of the people that then decides if it's tough to be in the Panthers, if it's tough to be in the National Organization for Women, and if I'm going to be the only Black woman in the Congressional Black Caucus, maybe I should start this organization called the National Black Feminist Organization. How many people in the room have heard of this organization? Okay. So the National Black Feminist Organization ends up having these giants, right? But at the time, they're not really giants, right? Like, this is like in the beginning of their lives. So you have Shirley Chisholm, you have Alice Walker. This is before she has written The Color Purple, right? Eleanor Holmes Norton, actually before she ends up being in Congress. Florence Kennedy, who was a lawyer in New York, and some people who aren't familiar with her, she ended up taking on a client who was locked up for having drugs. That client was none other than Billie Holiday. Okay, so that's one of Florence Kennedy's claim to fame. And then Margaret Sloan, who was a founder of Ms. Magazine. So they are the ones that decide, okay, we're going to try to put this race gender thing together. So what does the NBFO do? Michelle Wallace, who was a member, says, for 6 years, they fought patriarchy in the Black community, but for straight women, action became unthinkable. So one of the things that I try to explain to my students, right, because they can't imagine these women as young women, that these are women who are in their 20s, who are straight, who are simultaneously trying to date Black men and denounce patriarchy. Who, for anyone who's tried it, it's like a magic trick, right? And so, you know, they are particularly frustrated because that's where they are in their lives. So the Boston chapter decides to break off and become the Combahee River Collective, which I'm sure many people have heard of the Combahee River Collective, might not have heard of the National Black Feminist Organization. And they have no problems with breaking off because they identify as lesbians and they're like, we don't have this problem. We're going to get patriarchy and everything else. And we're going to, like, you know, deconstruct capitalism. We're going to do it all. And so, and I do like this picture because it does give you a sense of how young the women were at the time. And these women now are about 70 years old. Right? And so my students think of them in this particular moment, and I like to remind them that, you know, activism really is for young folks. And I know that because I just like giving talks. So what did Combahee do? Combahee established the first battered women's shelter in Boston. And let me talk about their name a little bit as well. So the Combahee River is in South Carolina, and it is the place where Harriet Tubman would cross people through so they would lose their scent to try to escape slavery. What the women in the North were thinking was, if they chose this name, you would have like this narrative that crossed boundaries so that like Black folks in Boston would think about like Black folks in the South and not, you know, be disconnected. So that's one thing. Also, what was going on is that in 1979, there were 12 Black women who were murdered within 2 miles within 5 months. And the Combahee River Collective lobbied the Boston Globe to move the story to the A section. So it was actually being covered near the sports section. And so, but the way that they had to do this organizing was that they were like actually making copies with carbon, right, and making flyers and distributing them and like organizing people in the community. They also got involved with the case of a Black woman who defended herself against sexual assault by a guard at Framingham State Prison. And he tried to attack her, she murdered him, then she was gonna get more time on her sentence. And I argue that this is like a precursor to abolition feminism, right? Not called that at the time, but we can see that this is happening in the 70s. So, and this is just an image of, you know, the Combahee River Collective statement, which is now on syllabi everywhere. If you take any kind of gender studies course, probably on any campus in the country, it would be difficult to, you know, not have run across this. But, you know, when I was in college, that was not necessarily the case. Okay. So why is that statement in this collective important to scholarship? It is Gloria Hull, Patricia Bell Scott, and Barbara Smith, who were all in that image that I just showed you, who were members of Combahee, that edited this anthology, All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, But Some of Us Are Brave. This is the first collection of essays that would be considered Black women's studies. And it makes it such that this can be a field in the academy, and Alice Walker teaches the first course on Black women's literature actually in '82 at Wesleyan. And so, you know, to give like a framing for this, I'm the youngest of 4. This means like the first 2 kids in my family could not have like taken Black women's studies in college, right? So I get to college like 5 years after this happens. And so that is how recent this transition has been, and how impactful their work was, because the women in Combahee were, many of them were graduate students who end up becoming faculty members. Okay, so one of the things I want to talk about now is that there's a lot of pushback in the 1970s. So the 1960s have all this progress with the civil rights movement, Black Power, you know, Students for Democratic Society, Vietnam, like all these second wave of feminism, Black women coming in with their feminism, all these things are happening. And then of course there's the creation of art like Ntozake Shange's choreo poem for Color Girls, all of this. And so as we know, right, kind of Obama Trump, right, like with progress is going to come resistance. And so after you have that kind of progress, you are going to have resistance to the creativity. And so this is like the Reagan era. And so the country becomes very conservative. And one of the things that I argue in the book is that a novel like The Color Purple, which becomes a movie that's you know, produced by Steven Spielberg, ends up becoming like a highbrow threat to Black masculinity and dominant culture. Anyone who's familiar with the English profession and the Modern Language Association, there were lots of fights at MLA about The Color Purple, and the fights were about Black men academics who were denouncing Walker's collaboration with Spielberg and also her depiction of Mr., right? And so I'm going to use this as a point of departure. I'm just going to read like a little bit from the book. The book, you know, it's kind of like when you have kids, like you're not supposed to have favorites, right? And so I do have like a few favorite pages from the book. So I'm going to share this with you to walk you through what some of my thoughts are. So while Alice Walker's novel may have presented a highbrow threat to Black masculinity and to dominant culture, the 1983 crowning of Vanessa Williams was a pop culture threat in the era of Reagan. To understand exactly what it was that Vanessa Williams represented and how her fall from grace constituted a threat to her symbolic accomplishment, it is first necessary to understand some of the dominant tropes used by politicians that cast Black women into the unidimensional role of welfare queen. One of Ronald Reagan's favorite anecdotes on the campaign trail, both in 80 and 84, was the story of a Chicago welfare queen who had 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 social security cards, and a tax-free income of over $150,000. This supposedly true story represented a melding of resentments against the poor. Reagan's depiction of the welfare queen was based on a woman from Chicago, Linda Taylor, who'd been charged with welfare fraud in '76. She was actually charged with defrauding the state of $8,000, not $150,000. Not only was Taylor misrepresented, but the president's extensive use of the welfare queen narrative served to permanently consolidate racist stereotypes of Black women within contemporary political discourse. And so I like to pause because a lot of people really don't think of, you know, the language, right? Welfare and queen going next to each other, actually coming out of the White House, right? It's like people would think, oh, that's probably something that, you know, came from some social conservative somewhere, right? But this is being written into our policies. So when Vanessa Williams was first crowned, her success at crossing the historical line of the Miss America pageant was read as evidence that Black women could be included, right? And so this is like a pop culture moment that might be difficult for some people to grab onto. But what's interesting is like what this meant in Black America. So former Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm said at the time, Williams's coronation was important. Even though it might not have put bread on the table, people might say, so what? Trying to consider the importance to the civil rights movement of a Black woman's winning of the crown. But the event was not trivial because it shows a sense that this country, whatever their motivation might be, seems to be trying desperately to move forward, right? Now, this might not make a lot of sense to folks, right? So here you have this light-skinned sister with green eyes, you have Shirley Chisholm, who's brown skinned, who's from the Caribbean, who's somehow celebrating this and saying like, you know, we have moved in any kind of direction. Right? For those that have come decades after this, there are not reflections of Black women in popular culture that are recognized as connected to beauty in any way whatsoever. In fact, there is like a Black Miss America pageant that like, you know, they refuse to televise. And so this is like a movement into the possibility of recognition, also in a way that is like somewhat controlled, somewhat, classed. Vanessa Williams comes from this like very well-to-do family that would be somewhat considered like Black society. And it's also the moment of the Cosby Show, where aspirations for many were this like heteronormative nuclear family where, the young men were doing certain things and the women are beautiful, right? This is where we are. Now, what happens? Williams' success and the narrative constructed around it doesn't last. Okay, in July of '84, which when people talk about the 11th hour, it's actually the 11th month that she is Miss America, Penthouse runs an issue that features her nude. Once again, younger folk are like, nude pictures are everywhere, not in '84, trust, okay? So work with me here. These photographs taken 3 years before the pageant were the reason that the Miss America Commission asked Williams to relinquish her crown and title, which, by the way, that had never happened before. It hasn't happened since. Vanessa Williams becomes this Icarus figure who flies too high and she falls, right? So once she loses this crown, members of the Black community feel betrayed, not by her, right? They feel betrayed by a system that they feel intentionally did this, right? Which brings us back to Shirley Chisholm. She's suspicious. She's like, I don't know what the motivation is. Like, now we're gonna celebrate this woman, but I'll celebrate her too. But what ends up happening is that this is a way to say to Black Americans, you're trying to do too much, you're trying to be too much, and you're not gonna be special. And so this exemplary queen of the 80s is quickly replaced by the quota and condom queens of the 90s. Okay, and so I'm doing this whole thing with this queen trope in the book. There's a big chunk in the book that I can't talk about now due to time constraints, and part of that is the Clarence Thomas Anita Hill incident. What I will mention, though, is that while I'm living through that and this is unfolding, in 1991, there were only 4 Black women in Congress. And only 2 of the 4 chose to speak in favor of Anita Hill. And one of them is Maxine Waters. The other is Eleanor Holmes Norton from the National Black Feminist Organization. Right? So all of these things kind of tie together. And there are only 4 white women in the Senate, which is partly why, people become enraged because these hearings are just in front of white men, which leads to '92 becoming the year of the woman, and Carol Moseley Braun wins her seat in Illinois, right? So here I am in Chicago. You don't need to hear me tell you about Carol Moseley Braun. You're one of the few places that actually knows anything about her.
I was just laughing because that's true.
Yeah, and so it's a breath of fresh air. So and this is I did a children's book, so like people would grow up knowing about her. So when she runs for re-election, despite the fact that at the time President Clinton, Vice President Al Gore, and then First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton all come to Illinois to campaign on her behalf, help raise funds, she's defeated by a white male Republican whose personal wealth is estimated at $40 million. Carol Moseley Braun's unsuccessful Senate term occurred during the Clinton era. And many Black women, myself included, were hopeful about the possibilities for expanded involvement in the political arena. Partly because in January '93, he chooses Maya Angelou as his inaugural poet, and he has attempts of trying to put Black people in presidential cabinets. But shortly after his inauguration, Clinton nominates his friend and former classmate, Lonnie Guinier, who, as we know, passed away at the beginning of this year, to the prestigious and crucial post of Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. Guinier's nomination sparked an immediate firestorm of criticism from the right, which labeled Professor Guinier as the quota queen and assailed her for ideas expressed in her publications. So as many of you all know, she's a law professor. She's talking about gerrymandering. The people who are reading her work actually aren't even smart enough to understand it. They take it out of context. And they're arguing that instead of she's talking about redrawing district lines, that she just wants quotas for Black people. It feels very much like Birth of a Nation, like if you don't watch them closely, they're gonna take the country back. And so she couldn't possibly have this position. Clinton gets nervous and backs down and doesn't even let her make her case. He insists that she withdraw her nomination and doesn't give her the opportunity to speak out in her defense. And so this ends up being a civil rights setback that people who are paying attention don't really appreciate. And so then we move forward, and this embarrassment ends up being followed by the scandal that engulfs Dr. Joycelyn Elders. How many people remember this? Okay, good. So we have some folks. So she's nominated in July of the same year to be Surgeon General. She's sworn in a little bit later, and then she lasts maybe 18 months, asked to resign. Her brief tenure exemplifies Black women's struggle to gain stature in the Democratic Party in general, but in Bill Clinton's cabinet in particular, right? And this feels bad because this is the guy from Hope, right? And then this is also the guy that Toni Morrison had said is our first Black president. And so the expectations were very different from the people that had come before him. So Surgeon General Joycelyn Elders was unceremoniously marked as a condom queen as a result of her position in which she advocated for the availability of condoms in public schools as a public health strategy. And so you'll also have to think about where we are in terms of the spread of HIV and AIDS and the lack of medications that exist because it's 94. And so these are the comments that she makes at a medical meeting. And I emphasize that, right? Because people are like, did she say it at elementary school? She said it at a medical meeting. And she says, condoms are not the government's solution to the teenage pregnancy crisis, but we want to make condoms available to those who choose to be sexually active. I'm not in the opinion that just because you have a condom, you're going to go out and have sex. There's not a person in this room that does not have car insurance, but you're not going to go out and have a wreck because of it. Okay? These are her comments. Clinton asks her to resign immediately. His response is, I'm sorry, but we just can't have any more of this. I want your resignation by 2:30 p.m. Now, as we all know, there's usually a process. An ousted official normally is permitted to maintain the illusion that she's voluntarily stepped aside. There's a polite exchange of letters. The White House, however, takes great pains to make clear that, Clinton has a certain moral high ground in demanding Elders to leave. Now, I know this just makes me petty, but like y'all, what happens after that? Monica, right? That's not in the book, but I just want y'all to think about that. So, the next section is called, of course, staying out of the bushes. So on November 7th, 2000, Al Gore thought that he'd lost the presidency, but he wasn't sure. After originally conceding the election, he retracted his concession and demanded a recount in what became the closest presidential election in American history at that time, right? Now we have all these people saying that like Trump should really be president again. So, Al Gore led the popular vote by a narrow margin. So in the 2000 election, the NAACP launched the biggest voter drive in its 91-year history, spending more than $10 million to encourage what civil rights leaders believe was the biggest Black voter turnout in decades, right? Because of course, this is pre-Obama, when Black people really show out. So voting records confirmed that Black voters in Florida and around the country turned out in these record numbers. Yet after the election, many complained that Florida election officials removed large numbers of minorities from state voting rolls, wrongly classifying them as convicted felons. So as you know, you have that going on, you got all your hanging chat dilemma, and then, I'm watching this also through the lens that my former academic advisor, Mary Frances Berry, is now heading the US Commission on Civil Rights, and she's doing the investigation into Florida. Of course, despite all the findings of irregularities, the Bushes are personal friends with the state attorney general of Florida, and as we all know, Bush wins. Oh my goodness, right? So 10 months after assuming his position, we realized that Bush is going to be faced with the bombing of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Most Americans outside of Oakland, California, didn't know much about California's 9th District U.S. Representative Barbara Lee. However, on September 15th, right, so this is 4 days after the towers fall, the Senate passed a use of force resolution and the House overwhelmingly approved it 420 to 1. Congresswoman Barbara Lee was the lone dissenting voice. Right? Think about that. Lee's resistance to Bush's domination provided a new model of Black female political leadership. So I'm going to move on to the Obama years. And how am I doing on time? Well, I have like 15 more? Okay, great. Okay, so I'll start here. In 2012, Pulitzer Prize winning author Ron Suskind released a book entitled Confidence Men, Wall Street, Washington, and the Education of a President. And his book is a story that follows the journey of Barack Obama and offers a portrait of this presidency. Suskind argues that the president surrounded himself with a team of seasoned players like Rahm Emanuel, Larry Summers, and Tim Geithner, who had served under different presidents. And because you all are like Illinois people, y'all like, I know, you got a lot going on with that. One of the big issues in Suskind's book is the treatment of women in the Obama administration. Anita Dunn, the former White House communications director, was interviewed and said, I remember once I told Valerie Jarrett that if it weren't for the president, this place would be a hostile workplace environment. And so she argues that, you know, the White House fits all the classic legal requirements for a genuine hostile workplace to women. So I mentioned Suskind's book because my book is similar, that I also discuss the treatment of women in the Obama administration, but it's different because I tell the story of what happened to the Black women in the first few years of his administration. So the Obama administration begins with promise. With the election of Obama came the appointment of the most diverse cabinet in history. 30% of Obama's cabinet appointments were women, 39% Black, Latino, and Asian. Among these appointments were many Black women. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Susan Rice. Lisa P. Jackson was the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. There's Melody Barnes, who's the director of domestic policy. Mona Sutphin, Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, and Peggy Hamburg, Food and Drug Administrator. And so initially, African-American women occupied about 7 of the 36 senior positions in the Obama administration. In addition to the appointment of a number of Black women to his administration and staff, during his first months in office, Obama took several actions that showed solidarity and support for women. So he signs off onto the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. And less than 2 months later, he signs executive order to create the White House Council on Women and Girls and has Valerie Jarrett head it along with Tina Chen. So it feels very much like the hopes and aspirations that we had with the Clinton administration. But similarly, we're gonna have some problems as well. So let's move on a little bit. Here we go. So you all know who this is, right? Because she's one of your people. She's from Chicago. So you originally have Desiree Rogers, who had been close friends with Michelle, who had worked here in Chicago, who decided that she would take them up on their offer to be the social secretary at the White House, okay? Now, let's do a little pop culture for a minute. How many of you all watch any of the Real Housewives ever? Thank you very much. So, Real Housewives of the Potomac, there is a tall, thin, blonde woman, like they all are, right? Who she and her husband decide that they're going to go to this dinner with dignitaries from India. And they actually, she puts on, you know, a silk sari and somehow gets through Secret Service and gets into this affair, right? When they realize that she's not on the list, instead of blaming Secret Service, which kind of makes sense to me, right? They blame Desiree Rogers. And so Desiree Rogers ends up stepping down, frustrated with how this has happened to her. And so if you look at the New York Times, they say, and the New York Times isn't always fair to Black women, but even they say that she's put in a position where the spotlight is going to be on her in a different way. She's not a Washingtonian. Anyone that knows about politics on the Hill knows that outsiders are treated in a particular way. And she comes into this high profile position. She's Black and a woman. It's too much, right? So this is early on in his presidency. And so you also end up having Melody Barnes stepping down, which was much more quiet and hush-hush. You don't get a lot about that. But I think the best example of how Black women struggled in Obama's administration is of Shirley Sherrod. So on March 27th in 2010, Shirley Sherrod is the USDA's Georgia Director of Rural Development. And she gave a 40-minute speech at an NAACP event. And during the speech, she shared her background with the audience, including the murder of her father in 1965 by two white men who were never indicted. She continued by relating an anecdote from her time working as the director of a nonprofit that aided Black farmers. She spoke frankly about how Roger Spooner, a white farmer, came to her for assistance, and at first, she was unenthusiastic about helping him, directing him to a white lawyer so it at least appeared that she tried to help. She then went on to explain that when the lawyer ultimately failed to assist Spooner, she called everyone she could think of to find help, and she ends up taking over and making sure that he gets the support that he needs. Sherrod said working with Spooner taught her an important lesson and made her realize that class played as much a role as race discrimination. She commented, working with him made me see that it's really about those who have versus those who don't. And they could be Black, they could be white, they could be Hispanic. It made me realize that I needed to work to help poor people and those who don't have access so that they can, live their lives. So 4 months later, conservative blogger at the time, he's no longer alive, Andrew Breitbart, if you remember him, right, posted a 2-minute and 38-second clip, taking this 40-minute speech and putting different pieces together. And he posted on his website, biggovernment.com, which had quite a following at the time. So he edits the tape so it sounds as though Sherrod ended her support for Spooner when she sent him to the white lawyer. And it makes it seem that she's not going to help him because he's a white man. He also misrepresents the story as taking place while Sherrod is in her position in the USDA, which that's not the case at all. And so he uses this doctored video, takes it out of context, and he argues that this is proof that the NAACP, which is being heavily criticized at the time by the Tea Party, is a racist organization, and because they support Shirley Sherrod. Now, all of this might sound like shenanigans, but it's actually taken very seriously by the Obama White House. And so he posts his thing at like 11 o'clock in the morning. And then as we know, with this 24-hour cycle, Fox News gets a hold of it. They're posting it, on their site and also online. And so what happens, the Obama White House calls for Sherrod's immediate resignation. And here you are, right? We're back to Joycelyn Elders all over again. And so conservative talk show host Bill O'Reilly taped his show that afternoon discussing the news revealed in the video. By the time it aired that evening, Sherrod had resigned after receiving 3 phone calls in her car from Cheryl Cook, who was the deputy undersecretary at the USDA. Sherrod said on the 3rd call, Cook asked her to pull over and submit her resignation via her BlackBerry because Sherrod was going to be on Glenn Beck that evening. Even the NAACP didn't pause to ask questions about the source of the video. That evening, Ben Jealous, who's the head of the NAACP at the time, says on Twitter, racism is about abuse of power. Sherrod had it at the USDA. She abused the white farmer because of his race. The NAACP is appalled. By the next day, it became apparent that Sherrod had been wronged. In an interview with CNN, she explained that the story that she told the video took place 24 years prior, and that she'd worked with the Spooners and had helped them save their farm. When asked why she didn't tell the USDA this, when they called her, she said, I did. But for some reason, Fox, the Tea Party, and all of this scared the administration. So that evening, Democratic strategist Donna Brazile said on CNN that she'd listened to the entire tape and that it had been taken out of context. And so it isn't until this Black woman comes forward and speaks that the Secretary of Agriculture actually comes forward, apologizes, and says that Sherrod should step back into her role. Sherrod decides not to step back into the role. Even after the NAACP also ends up putting forth an apology. But this is what Sherrod said. She said that she deserved a call from Obama. And she said she thinks that he owed her an apology. And so her remarks were, I'd like to talk to him a little bit about the experience of people like me, people at the grassroots level, people who live out in rural America, people who live in the South. I know he does not have that kind of experience. Let me help him a little bit with how we think, how we live, and the things that are happening. What Sherrod said emphasizes a key issue that comes into play with her forced resignation. Obama and his staff either lacked the experience or the point of view from African Americans or the courage to come forward and do anything about it. Despite his own racial background as the first literally African-American president, it seemed that he did not want to deal with race during his first administration. Not only that, Maureen Dowd, who was quite critical of Obama in the New York Times, said that if anyone in his administration had any knowledge about the civil rights movement, they would have recognized the name Sherrod. The Reverend Charles Sherrod was a civil rights leader who co-founded the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He is Shirley's husband, and he actually passed away last week. And so one of the questions was like, how are these people who are organizing somehow not close enough and influential enough to impact what's happening in these presidential politics? And so Dowd goes on and quotes Congressman James Clyburn, right, who then ends up being able to use his influence recently and saying, you cannot continue to betray us, Democratic Party. And Clyburn said that he didn't think a single Black person had been consulted before the decision to fire Sherrod. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton from the National Black Feminist Organization said, the president needs some advisors or friends who have a greater sense of the pulse of the African American community, or at least been around the mulberry bush. So Sherrod's forced resignation brings to mind, of course, Lonnie Grenier, Dr. Joycelyn Elders, and sadly, years later, these things continue. And so, let's see here. All right, we're gonna move up. We're gonna move up to 2016. And so I lived in the Twin Cities for 31 years, which from their vantage point still makes me an outsider. But I'm gonna claim Minnesota, and so I have to have an image of Prince. And so I have this image up here because, we have the Trump-Hillary election. And I have this image where you have a very distressed, Prince, a meme that is made that says, girl, I guess I'm with her, right? Now, what's fascinating about the political behavior of Black women is that 94% of Black women vote for Hillary, okay? Which made Black women the strongest voting bloc for Hillary. But there was lots of hesitation, right? And one of the reasons why there was hesitation was at Hillary's hesitance to embrace Black Lives Matter. right? And her commitment to elite Black women, but not to Black women who are organizing, who are on the ground, or working class, or anything of that nature. And so what's also important to realize is that 52% of white women vote for Trump, right? And so this also gives us an understanding why you still have like these separate feminisms, right? Because people ask me all the time, you know, why would there be a need still for Black feminist organizing? And that's really, you know, the data shows that Black women and white women still see many issues very differently. So he gets elected. I don't want to centralize him because it's not about him. And he tries, right, once. And so I've gone through with you all, like from the Kennedy administration all the way up to the Obama administration, these attempts, even though, you know, we have definitely some issues of getting Black women in these posts, Trump says, I've got one. I've got one, and I've got my, you know, media friend from reality, and, you know, I'm gonna kick him Omarosa. He can't even like play nice with Omarosa for 4 years. So Omarosa ends up leaving in a huff, publishes Unhinged, an insider's account of the Trump White House. And, you know, that might have been her point the whole time, because I'm sure she made more money from the book than she would have been paid as a government official. And so, you know, that is how that plays out. And so this brings us full circle to, you know, where can we see a future for Black feminist organizing, right? Sometimes it can come from appointments. Sometimes it can come from elected office. But often, like, the future of Black feminism needs to come from activism. It needs to come from the 3 queer women who organized Black Lives Matter. It needs to come from Tarana Burke, who was actually the first person to say, "Me too." Like, it has to come from there, because if it doesn't come from there, then, you know, you can't get someone like Cori Bush, right, who was a first responder when Michael Brown was laying on the ground in Ferguson, Missouri, who was a nurse, who ends up leaving that and becoming a member of Congress. You can't get Ayanna Pressley, who I see that she's holding one of her favorite books. So she's smart, right? You can't get these women without the community work. And we have to understand that. And so it's kind of a continuum where you get Black Lives Matter, you get Me Too, you get, you know, the farthest left, Black women in the Congress, which then also makes space for these Black women who are clearly more center than any of the other women I've talked about, but also play an important role in where we are in the country now. And so I'll leave it at that.